Jamaica's population is estimated at approximately 2.7 million people. The number of murders and other violent acts causes the country to have one of the highest murder rates per capita in the world. One of the main breeding grounds for violence and criminality is gangs. Our reporter Marlon Samuels delves into the issue in this report.
Gangs are a major security issue across the country. They are the source of majority of violent crimes in the nation. So says Joanna Callen, crime security and justice researcher at the Caribbean Policy Research Institute. She pointed out that in 2019, the JCF said there were approximately 381 gangs across the country. These gangs are classified in 3 categories.
JCF uses a classification system where you have the first generation gangs. These tend to be more loosely organized groups that tend to operate in a smaller territory. There is no form of distinct leadership per se, and they're out to prove themselves just because they're kind of the new kid on the block, right? And then you have the second generation gangs, where these gangs have been around a bit longer, and so there's a more cohesive unification of the group, and there's a more distinct leadership hierarchy. There's some structure in place, and they tend to be more goal-oriented in what they're doing. Now, there are also third-generation gangs, but as it stands right now, JCF doesn't believe that any third-generation gangs exist. Now, an example of a third-generation gang that existed several years ago would have been the Shower Posse, which was an extremely well-organized, large, distinctive operation. At one point, the Klansman was also that kind of third-generation gang, but because of the intra-gang warfare that took place within the Gangsman between the Tesha Miller faction and the Andre Blackman faction, we've kind of seen it disintegrate, so it's not as cohesive as it once was or well-organized.
Ms. Callen underscored the point that violent crimes by gangs can be a real problem in Kingston and other parts of the country. They represent a common and significant threat to many communities.
Especially where there is an indiscriminate level of violence that doesn't, as I mentioned, it doesn't just target the gangsters themselves. It spreads across to innocent bystanders who may not necessarily be involved in gang-related activities. But just because a community member, somebody comes from a specific community, then they'll end up being targeted. If it is that issue or the issue of gangs is not addressed in a manner where it curtails their inclination towards indiscriminate acts of violence, then it literally means that at any given time, anybody is going to be a victim in our society.
The researcher also pointed out that Jamaica is ranked the second most homicidal country in Latin America and Caribbean region. Ms. Callen says violence affects the country's GDP in several ways.
The sheer cost that it takes for the hospitals when they're dealing with these injuries is a burden to the healthcare system. One treatment for a single person can run as high as in the hundreds of thousands. It means that once we have so many incidences of violence coming in to our accident and emergency or ERs in the hospitals, it means that the staff is going to be more pressured to deal with so many cases. It means that the medicine, the blood, the equipment, it all costs money to deal with this. Then there's the possible loss of work, which translates into loss of productivity. If these people aren't able to work because of the severity of their injuries, then it is a loss of productivity, which contributes to our GDP. And the main victims in the homicide rate in Jamaica are males between 15 and 35 years old. We're wiping out an entire group of potential earners. If somebody is incapable, if they're the primary breadwinner for their family, and especially if they're an innocent victim in the spate of violence, you're going to find where if this person is a breadwinner, then it affects the contribution of the household to the economy. Then again, you also have the cost that the government has because we have such a high violence rate and crime rate. The government now has to expend an enormous amount of resources to address the issue. And these are resources that could have gone into other sectors to otherwise boost and assist productivity in the country.
In January 2018, due to rampant violence and murders, the government of Jamaica declared states of emergency, SOE, and zones of special operations, ZOZOs, for several parishes including the Kingston metropolitan area and the parish of St. James. The research conducted by the Caribbean Policy Research Institute, CAPRI, Guns Out, the Splintering of Jamaica's Gangs, will be launched at the Terra Nova Hotel in Kingston on Wednesday, March 4, 2020. Reporting for the news on PBCJ, I am Marlon Samuels.